Hello and welcome to another wonderful edition of Side Crisis, where, as you well know, I
go solo for a while. I need to fly alone.
I need to fly alone on these because I cannot be interrupted by anyone telling me that current games are better than these older games, because I just don't think that that's true. And even if it is true, I would not admit it here, because you know what?
You know what? It's time for me to go home. This is enough. I've had enough.
I've had enough. And by go home, I obviously mean go and play more Super Nintendo, and that's what we're gonna do. So we've played ActRaiser, we've played Legend of the Mystical Ninja. I wanted to move forward. I wanted to show off a little bit more of what the Super Nintendo, quite frankly, is capable of, because that is kind of the thing. We look at the period of time where the Sega Genesis was just running roughshod, killing the Super Nintendo at the time because the marketing was just so effective. And make no mistake, I will be playing some goddamn Sega Genesis and maybe some of those weirdo warts that you attach to a Sega Genesis in the Sega CD and 32X, the full tower of power, as it were, because I think it's a great console. I love it all. I'm Swiss, all right. I think playing the my console is better than your console thing has always been dumb for as long as there has been choice. I think that is stupid. Now it's one thing if you can't own them all for a variety of reasons. Sure, I get that. But if you're really into video games and you can, then fuck it. Play as many. That's the thing. Play as many video games on as many different platforms as you can, because why not? Choice is always a good thing. So anyway, Super Nintendo. I want to talk about the hardware a little bit. I'm going to hold up the Super Famicom while I do this, just because the other guy is plugged in, and I don't want to futz around with wires. Anyway, so this is effectively the exact same thing as the Super Nintendo. It's just the Japanese version. Inside this glorious box of magic is a very slow CPU, and it's one of the reasons why that Genesis marketing was so effective, is that they could demonstrate and show you that the power of their main CPU, the Motorola 68000, was zippy. On a megahertz standpoint, I think this is like a 3.5 megahertz chip, and I can't remember what the Genesis is off the top of my head, but it's more than that for sure. And that's what blast processing was all about. So, but there's a bunch of other shit in here that, in working conjunction with the slow clock speed of this hardware, really makes it shine. So the total on-screen colors on this thing at one time, for the Genesis, it's only 64. For this, it's a multiple of that, like a pretty decent one. It had a library of more colors, and if you look at ports, take a real popular one. So take the Genesis port of, say, Mortal Kombat 2, and compare it to Super Nintendo. It's like almost night and day. Like, I'm not saying that the Genesis version of Mortal Kombat 2 is like a abject piece of shit. If that's what you had, that's what you had. But let's just say the truth here. Mortal Kombat 2 on the Super Nintendo is an infinitely better port, as is all the Street Fighter games. They look better, sounded better, and they played a little better. However, on the Genesis version, especially of Street Fighter 2 Championship Edition, you have that extra star business, and you can make that game tweaker fast, because the Genesis could do that and the Super Nintendo couldn't. But so fast forward, go down the line a little bit. We're taking it to like 1996. The next generation has already started. So PlayStation had been on the market for a while. N64 wasn't out yet, but it would be coming out at the fall of 1996. Saturn, of course, was already on the market. Super Nintendo's still doing pretty well. There's still games coming out. In 96, you had Donkey Kong Country 3 come out. The last game on the Super Nintendo was the last Nintendo published game was Kirby Dream Land 3, which came out in like 1997 or something. I think the last game that came out overall was a version of Frogger that Majesco put out. It's just Frogger, but it came out in 1998. So that's a year after GoldenEye came out. Just try that on. There was Super Nintendo games being published and sold in America while GoldenEye had already been out for like a while, like a good amount of time. So anyway, 1996. This is a really bad label version of Street Fighter Alpha 2. Now, you're probably saying, hey, Brian, what? What? Yes, Street Fighter Alpha 2 came out on the Super Nintendo. And in my opinion, look, there are better ways to play Street Fighter Alpha 2. There's no question about that. But for what this thing is, it's kind of like a technical marvel. I think if you're a person who's played the PC Engine version of Street Fighter 2 Championship Edition, and you marvel at the fact that that is an 8-bit version of Street Fighter 2 Championship Edition, and the gameplay is great, looks great, I think it plays really, really well. But like, hey man, you're playing Street Fighter 2 on an 8-bit machine. To me, it's like you're playing totally an all-the-way 32-bit game on a Super Nintendo with this thing. And we'll get into, there's certainly a place to criticize this version. There's no two ways about it, and it's kind of glaring, and you'll see it immediately. But once you are able to wrap your brain around how that bummer of a thing works, then it's you can allow yourself to have a good time with this port. And it's all there. All the characters are there. Hidden characters are there. Obviously, they trimmed frames of animation. The sprites are a little smaller, but it looks really, really good. And we're also going to be playing it on, and I have 2 of these I'm going to show off. These are so weird. These are, focus camera, these are Capcom produced. You can see right there on this one. That's a Capcom molded thing. This is the, I think they call this the Capcom Pad Soldier. I have the Japanese versions here, but I think it was called the Fighting Commander in America. And I remember these being advertised in GamePro. I believe they were mail order, or you'd have to go to like a mom and pop shop, like a video game hobbyist shop, and buy them there. But they're just so weird. So let's take a look at this thing. I'll get it. Focus. There we go. So it's like you grip it like a pistol grip thing. Come on, focus in there. And then for this deal, so left hand on the D-pad, and this is actually really comfortable. Like this feels really, really, really good. But then with your right hand, the way that this like jettisons out, whatever you want to call it, the idea was that you'd put your thumb here underneath it, and then like an arcade, you use your piano playing fingers to use the buttons. You can also easily hold it like this, but it kind of fits weird. But this, it's not terrible. And then like you got this pistol grip with the D-pad. It's just a strange, weirdo looking controller. And for me, like this era of controllers, like on the one hand, the quality of this stuff, not super good, kind of shit. But there's a lot of stuff that had just such cool, weird ideas. This is certainly one of them. They also Capcom published and produced a joystick under the same line, the Capcom Fighting Commander line, or Capcom Pad Soldier line in Japan. And that's actually a pretty decent arcade stick, especially at a time where arcade sticks were typically pretty bad. It's either that or you had to spend a lot of money on like a Mass Systems joystick that used like all the way authentic parts. But those were total mail away, like $200, $300 things that you could buy back then. So that's like $700 today, which is absurd. But hey, Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, these games were some of the most popular games in the world at that time. So you were probably going to spend that money. Real quick, let's get a check-in. Let's get a check-in from the Hamster. How you doing, buddy? What do you think about this?
There was a big prop room and water guns. It was just a fun atmosphere.
I agree. I don't know what you mean by the water guns or props. Well, props, sure. But I am trying very hard here to create a fun atmosphere, and I thank you. I thank you very much for that.
Easy there, compadre.
Whoa!
After all the shit that you pulled,
What?
I think you can at least hear me out. I mean, I feel like you owe me that.
I do owe you that, and I want to hear you out. Are you saying to me that Street Fighter Alpha 2 on Super Nintendo doesn't deserve this kind of attention? What do you think?
I had a blast with Corey.
Okay, well then you're going to have a blast with Street Fighter Alpha 2 on the Super Nintendo. So, let me go ahead and get that set up. I do have to plug this guy in. So I'm going to do that, and we're going to come back with Street Fighter Alpha 2 rockin' and rollin' on Super Nintendo. Okay, here we are, and I'm going to go ahead and show up right here in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Let's do a little sound up on the game. There we go. You can hear some of those tunes. which I think is kind of cool to hear Street Fighter Alpha 2 music playing on what is one of the most famous features of the Super Nintendo, the sound chip. A lot of people know this now because it's been out there for several years, but the sound chip on the Super Nintendo was designed by Sony, which led to the infamous Sony Super Nintendo CD relationship that just kind of, I mean, who really knows what happened to that thing? But so Sony was going to release the Sega CD-like add-on for the Super Nintendo CD. Secretly behind the backs of Sony, Nintendo was also doing a deal with Philips, the European electronics manufacturer that also was a part of the CD-ROM consortium at the time. And neither company knew that the other one was working with Nintendo. And then Sony was a lot further along. They actually had like a working prototype, which most people know this part of the story because it was recently discovered. Well, not recently, like 5-10 years ago, an actual working Super Nintendo CD or Nintendo PlayStation was discovered. And you can, check out a lot of footage on that because it's been like, it had been touring different retro game shows. And people who like have done teardowns and actually try to get it working. And I think they did get it working. Ben Heck got it working. So that's kind of cool. Anyway, that didn't happen with Philips. What happened with Philips is they made the terrible system, the CDI, which is really the only major video game system that I have left to actually try to play. I've never owned one of those ever, neither back in the cheap days or certainly not now in the expensive days. But I kind of want to cross that one off my list. I want to go for it. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression. Let's talk about Street Fighter Alpha 2 for Super Nintendo. So, once again, I am playing on this insanely weird controller, the Capcom Pad Soldier, which I do... Look, I think this controller is kind of cool. It feels good in the hands, and it's kind of nice to have a D-pad and then also be able to hit buttons like you would a joystick. So let's check out some modes, standard stuff. You got your options, you got your arcade and your versus. There's no like tournament or anything like that. Let's go into options real quick. Let's turn that difficulty down because, and then let's do speed up to Turbo 2 and there we go. Exit. Okay, so let's check out this character select screen, which is a pretty iconic little bit from Alpha 2. So look at that. I mean, it's the real deal, man. It looks, if this was on a TV and you were just kind of walking through a room, you would think that there was someone playing Alpha 2 on a 32-bit system, that kind of thing. You have to actually sit there and actually look at the animation of the sprites to see a little bit beyond that. But for what this thing is, I think it's really cool. There's a specialty chip inside the cartridge. I believe it's the SA2, or it's the SA1 or the SA2. And I could be wrong. It might not be either one of those. But I'll just say there's a specialty chip in this cartridge that actually uses compression. And so it packs way more information than a Super Nintendo cartridge could usually hold, which I think at the maximum of like a published game in North America, I think it was 32 megs. In Japan, there's a version of a Tales game, I think it's Tales of Fantasia, that I want to say is like 64 megs or something like that. It's the biggest game that was released in the global library for Super Nintendo. And on that one, if you wanted to play it on like say an EverDrive, you actually have to have the more advanced EverDrive, like the SD to SNES, in order to play that ROM. Or you buy the game and learn how to read Japanese. Either one is doable. Either one is doable. So as you can see, this is the full roster. And like I said, I think the hidden characters are in here too, but I didn't look that up ahead of time. And I'm not going to now. So I'll say that they are in, and if they're not in, then apologies for being dumb and lazy. So, excuse me. Let's do, okay, I will pick, I'm a Bison dude, although I'm not an Alpha Bison guy. In my opinion, they kind of took away the Psycho Crusher as a normal move, which kind of weakened my game, but everything else about him is there. But let's pick him. And then right as we get going in here, you'll see, so I'm gonna pick manual. Auto is automatic guarding. I don't need that shit. And then turbo is faster gameplay. as you should all well know. Okay, so what's going to happen here? You see that stutter? There's another stutter. And this is people's main complaint about the game is coming up right now. So you're at the beginning of a fight. Let's say you're playing with a friend. It's different in single player. It's not that big of a deal. So there's that stutter. And then it says fight. And then there's that what is that, like a 3 or 4 second delay. That's the game actually loading data, like a CD-ROM. It's loading data from the cartridge. And look, this game got just dinged up royally in the reviews because of that. And I know a lot of people today who kind of shit on this version of the game because of that. And I get it. Like, you know, if you're not used to it, the game tells you to fight, and then Street Fighter instinct kicks in, and like if you're me and you play as charge characters, like I'm already holding back to charge. And then I release it too early, I prematurely blow my scissor kick, then, you know, that could mess with things. But in my opinion, I think the point is kind of moot if you play this game a lot, because you get used to it and you can kind of figure out that timing. But it would be ideal if it wasn't there at all. But that's just the way they made the game. It is what it is. And there's that dumb pause again. You'll see that again as I continue playing this game. But that's, I think, by far the biggest negative of this version of the game. And it was definitely the game got the crap beat out of it back in the day because of it. But that's kind of it. That's the only negative. Like, let's talk about the background. It looks awesome. To me, it looks just as good as well, okay, that's a bit of a stretch, I have to admit. It looks really good. I think comparing it to the Saturn or the arcade or the PlayStation is kind of stupid. But for being a game that was, you know, firmly a 32-bit era game, playing on a Super Nintendo that came out in 1990, you know, in Japan, but granted, the hardware came out in 1990. To me, it's endlessly impressive. I think it's awesome. And it feels good to play with this weirdo Capcom controller. All right, I'm gonna blast through these. So this background stage was always kind of a favorite of mine. You see that little kid in the room back there, sitting crisscross applesauce, really close to a TV, ostensibly playing video games. So I should maybe on a future installment of Side Crisis, Super Nintendo Edition, I will bring out a Super Famicom controller so we can take a look at that. There's a couple differences. It's got different coloring. The body is the same. By far, the biggest difference is how long that cord is. It's like criminally short. And that has a lot to do with just how Japanese living rooms were and maybe still are. But, you know, usually people would play their video games like right up on their TV in Japan. And so the idea of having like a super long cable, that was an American thing and a European thing. It wasn't a Japanese thing. So yeah, maybe on the next one I'll dig that controller out and we could take a look at how criminally short that cable is. Like, to me nowadays, like, there's so many ways to utilize, I mean, they make like Bluetooth adapters so you can play Super Nintendo with modern controllers if you want. One of the things I like to do is I have an 8BitDo Bluetooth adapter, and I use the Switch Online Super Nintendo controllers with that. So that way I can plug my Super Nintendo, I can plug it into my RetroTink and put it on my big ass flat screen TV, and then sit on my couch very far away from the TV and just dig right in. It's super convenient. And you can achieve the same thing with extension cables, which now, I mean, you can buy those things all day long on eBay and Amazon. Okay, I'm going to try to do, so charge characters and me with D-pads, it's not a good mix. I'm more of a joystick guy. But I did just do that Super Psycho Crusher, which is what we wanted. And that felt great. So with Bison, they did change, and so instead of the Psycho Crusher, his charge forward and punch is this projectile, which, like, okay, it's kind of cool that they gave Bison a projectile, but at the same time, his body was the projectile with the Psycho Crusher, and then you get the advantage of, like, and you're moving to the next section of the stage, which you could use offensively and defensively. I think You could make the argument that Bison was a little bit too powerful in some older Street Fighter 2 games, but and so maybe the answer to that was nerfing him in Alpha. But in later versions of Street Fighter, like SNK versus Capcom, he plays like the Street Fighter 2 one. So they gave him back the Psycho Crusher and all that good stuff. All right. So yeah, that was not a glitch, not a freeze. That's the cartridge loading data. And there we go. Okay. So I mean, you see what I mean? You can get used to that. And look, like, you remember what it was like playing PlayStation and Saturn games. Like back in the day, like that was a part of the deal. You know, I owned a Neo Geo CD. It was the first Neo Geo thing that I ever bought. I bought it on a trip to Japan back in 2003. Owning Neo Geo hardware was such a big deal to me. Growing up super duper poor, it was essentially the Rolls Royce of games. And you bet your sweet ass I'm going to be doing a Neo Geo Side Crisis, a whole run of them. And I'm going to do it on arcade because I have a 4-slot MVS cabinet and I have some other means to play authentic Neo Geo stuff. Anyway. Neo Geo CD had just loading time that should have been illegal. It was so bad. And it was a single speed CD-ROM drive. So you're talking about like load times of like 30 seconds, 45 seconds. Just insane. PlayStation and Saturn weren't that way, but some of those games did have some pretty egregious loading times. That is the argument why N64 went cartridge, which I think was a bad argument at the end of the day. But yeah, a Super Nintendo with loading time. It's a weird thing. Now I am curious how well this game performed on Super Nintendo. Like, I think by and large the Alpha series, although it's like beloved, and definitely it was beloved at the time. Like it did pretty well. But I think it's more so beloved today than it was back in the day. Just because the Street Fighter 2 bubble, Capcom kind of burst it themselves by, releasing 50 versions of Street Fighter 2. They kind of ran the well a little dry. But what are you going to do when you're making the most popular game in the world and your business? Like that's kind of your sole function is making money, right? Anywho, being that this game came out so late in the Super Nintendo lifestyle, and a lot of people maybe had moved on and bought PlayStations and Saturns, and they could play like a pretty damn near arcade perfect port. But for those people that didn't move on yet and they wanted to play this game at home, I don't think this cartridge was very cheap. I think it was like like a $70 game. Again, that's $70 in '96 money. But I don't know. Maybe the game did pretty well. And it's go time. Okay. One thing I haven't mentioned yet, and this isn't... so I'm using a RetroTink to play this game RGB into my switcher setup here. But I am not doing any of that cropping. So like on your screen, you kind of see that this is like presented in like a shrunk down screen. That's how the game is. So if I had this plugged into my CRT television, it would be the same thing. You'd see the black bars horizontally and vertically around it. I think that's a way that it was a workaround that they had to do to get the game to work, because you have less real estate to render on-screen pixels. And I'm no engineer. I think this is how this works. But the fact that there's like you have an out there, like it allowed the developers a little more leeway to have the game maybe run a little faster, that kind of stuff. So it was a concession that they had to make. Not that big of a deal. It's not like playing Doom on the 32X where, the screen is like a joke. It's so small it's a joke. Although the 32X version of Doom did have music in it. So take that, Jaguar version. I love the Jaguar version of Doom, so, it hurt me to say that. But I said it nonetheless. All right, let's take a gander here. Very good. I don't know if I'm going to do a full arcade run or not. We're about halfway there. Let's check out Zangief. I love Zangief's Alpha Sprite so much. He looks so cool. The bear fighting scars are so prominent. Boom. Oh God. Yeah, I think there's always a point in Street Fighter games where you have like a, even if you are a baby like me and you put the difficulty down low just to get through it, there is always a character that comes like in the middle of the playthrough that bumps it up just a little bit. Just a bit. I'm trying to burn that first continue off. Ah! I can't do it. I wonder if Bison has his super kick. Does he have this? He does! Take that. Take that, you bozo. Get him with the head scissor and the punch. Oh, anyone's game now. Got him. Cheaped out with the throw. A W is a W. Okay, let's see. Let's finish up with Zangief here. That's what we'll do. That's what we'll do. So these weirdo Capcom controllers that I have, are they worth buying? I say yes. If you are someone who has a fascination with game accessories, controllers, that kind of stuff, I think they're unique enough to where the purchase is warranted. I bought mine in a 2-pack not that long ago. I would say maybe 4 or 5 years pre-COVID. It was definitely pre-COVID, so they might be a lot more expensive now. But I do think that the Japanese versions are still a lot cheaper than the American ones, and they work exactly the same. The only difference is I think the writing on the controller is different. So yeah, I would recommend it because it's kind of fun. It's a fun way to play Street Fighter. You can play other games with these things too. Obviously, it's just a fucking Super Nintendo controller. Mortal Kombat plays pretty fun with them. All right, I'm gonna do a little bit of this. Ooh. Okay, I'll fight Akuma, and then we'll stop. So okay, Alpha 2. I have to admit here, I had moved on from Super Nintendo when it first came out. At the time, I didn't have an N64 because it wasn't available yet. But I was playing a lot of PC games at my neighbor's house. Playing a lot. I had a Super Nintendo and a Genesis, so at the time, I think I was a little bit more into the Genesis. Hadn't gotten a PlayStation, hadn't gotten a Saturn. But by the time this game was kind of on my radar, I did have an N64. So I remember going to like a Blockbuster and renting this, and I was impressed by it. It was, I didn't have the other CD-based system, so I couldn't play Alpha 2, obviously, on the N64, because there was like no Capcom fighting games on the N64. So this was kind of fun for me to play it on the Super Nintendo. But I will say that I think I definitely appreciate it more today than I did back then. And to me, it has more to do with the fact that it exists at all. That it is like a thing that technically works versus like the overall quality of the port. I do think, but I genuinely do think that it's a pretty decent port. And if you are like the one person in the world that only has a Super Nintendo and you want to play Street Fighter Alpha 2, well, boy, do I have the game for you. Oh, come on. Oh, that sneaky teleport that Akuma does in this game. This is not going to work out for us. And that's fine. I wanted to stop anyway. Okay, let's do this and that. Okay. So, this weird controller is weird and fun. This game right here, that I'm going to take out of the clutches of my Super Nintendo, crappy label version and all, it's a great game. It's a greater, cooler technical showpiece than it is a great game. But I do think it's a great game. It's included here as one of these hand-picked Super Nintendo games that I want to show off. More because it is technically impressive to me than it is like one of my all-time favorite games. I think pound for pound, I would say my favorite Street Fighter 2 on Super Nintendo is Turbo, just Street Fighter 2 Turbo. I think it's excellent, and I certainly spent the most amount of time playing that one. But like I said, Alpha 2, it's the fact that it exists and works at all is kind of a miracle, and so that alone makes it interesting. Okay, let's check in real quick with the hamster. Let's see if he's changed his attitude a little bit.
You know what? It's time for me to go home. This is enough. I've had enough.
I get it. I've had enough too, and so we'll call it here. And
I had a blast with Corey.
okay, well, I had a blast playing Street Fighter Alpha 2 on Super Nintendo, Corey. So I'll just say that. Like, subscribe. I'm coming back with more Side Crisis. We're playing more Super Nintendo. I'm not done, and I am not ready to go home like the hamster was. But anyway, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.